The first Federalist paper that we're going to spend time looking at is the most famous of all the Federalist Papers. We're going to look at Federalist number 10. So just like the rest of them, Federalist number 10 was written anonymously. We now know that this was written by James Madison. Federalist 10 is Madison's explanation about how the government can deal with factions, which are a danger that he's worried about, and what the best kind of government to limit the impact of factions would look like. Let's start with the idea of factions. So in Federalist number 10, the main issue that he's writing about is what he calls a faction. And what a faction is this is a group of people who get together and look after what's best for them. And they put what's best for them over what's best for all of society combined. So this is not a weird thing at all. This is probably how we mostly interact. We kind of look out for ourselves and for our group, and we don't necessarily always prioritize what's best for everyone in the country here. So factions are a pretty normal thing, but for a government that's going to give power to the people, factions are particularly potentially dangerous. So what Madison says here is that we cannot control what causes the faction, because what causes the faction are things like freedom of speech and being able to think and discuss, and he doesn't want to take those away. So since we can't control the cause of the faction, all we can do is control the effects of the faction. So he's looking at, let's design a government that will be the best way to limit the effects that the faction can have. So he starts with the assumption that factions are dangerous. And so since factions are dangerous, we need to make sure that the government has the ability to control their effects. So he would say that if we used a system that looked more like direct democracy, where the voters had direct control of things, that would not do a good job of limiting the factions. And so that could possibly be a dangerous form of government, where different groups of people got control and did what was best for their group at the expense of what was best for the whole. So what Madison prefers instead is what we have, which is a representative democracy, or what we call a republic. So he wants us to elect leaders to make decisions for us. And the election of leaders is a really important feature of the government here. So if we elect representatives to make decisions for us, that government is going to be better suited to deal with the problem of faction. Madison's ideal government here is a republic, and he describes that as he wants a small number of citizens making decisions who've been elected by the rest of the citizens. So what he thinks is going to be better about this system is that the people that end up representing the government are going to be more focused on what's best for all of society. Now let's think about how that works, right? A person, like a faction, might only look after their own interest, but a faction may not be enough to win enough votes to serve in office. So a person running for office is going to have to appeal to so many different people across the society that they're going to end up being more in the middle in order to appeal to the most people. Their goal to win office and to keep office is going to be to please as many people as they can. And in this way, we can limit the power of any individual faction, because the officials, the representatives serving in the government, are trying to please as many of those factions as they can. So the factions won't necessarily get all they want, but they'll get a more compromised, moderate version of what they're hoping for. The bigger the elections, even better. The bigger the elections, the more people involved, then the more moderate those representatives are going to become in order to try to be acceptable to the largest number of voters. There's this other benefit to the idea of the republic as well. So not just the fact that we're electing people is good, but also a republic allows for the government to grow as the country grows. So this is another way that the Constitution creates a flexible plan of government for the United States. So this is not just a plan for the 13 colonies, but is a plan that works eventually for the 50 states, or even in the future, possibly more states. So we can add representatives as we add population, and then the government will function in the same way. Now, Madison also wants to make sure that this is a large republic, because we can tell what his hidden message is here. He's talking a lot about what he calls the majority faction. So he's beginning to show us his fears of the tyranny of the majority, a little fear of what the public could do if they had total control of the government here. So he explains that the biggest cause of factions is that wealth is not evenly distributed among all people. So the biggest faction that he's worried about is non-rich people. Non-rich people clearly make up the majority of every society, and the rich people are a small minority. So he's laying out his plan for how important it is for us to protect minority rights, and that the republic would be able to do so. So he thinks that the large republic would be able to protect the minority, in this case would be the wealthy landowners, against the majority faction, which in this case would be the non-wealthy regular people. Because the republic is designed to produce moderation or moderate government officials that are going to make decisions for us, that's going to prevent the majority faction, in this case non-wealthy people, from completely dominating the government. We know that he also adds several other features to the Constitution that limit the power of the public or the majority here, but this is one of his motivating factors for that. He wants to make sure that that property rights are protected and that minority groups are protected in this Republican structure. So this is all very old stuff. This is all 1787 ideas. Let's make some sense of this for 2020 politics here. If we're trying to figure out what a faction is today, like what is a group of people that look after their own self-interests and not necessarily the interests of the whole of society? Well, we have two obvious examples in modern politics, and this would be political parties and interest groups. Political parties are a version of a faction. A political party, the Democrats or the Republicans, they go out and they advocate for what is best for their people, right? So Democrats go out and try to do what's best for the people that vote Democrat, and Republicans try to go out and do what's best for the people that vote Republican. They both argue that they're doing what's best for everyone, but we can see in their policies that their policies do the most to benefit those people who are supporting them. Interest groups are the same. Interest groups are a little more obvious. Interest groups that you might have heard of, the most likely one that you've heard of is the National Rifle Association. It's an interest group that advocates for gun owners. So they go out and they advocate for what's best for members of the National Rifle Association, even if that is not the best for all of society. So they advocate for things like letting people carry guns without licenses. They advocate for freedom to own different types of weapons. They advocate for things like being able to take your gun into places like bars or airports. And those are not the kind of things that are best for society. However, the republic, the large republic that Madison designed, limits the power of this group. So they can have some influence, but we don't have to worry about them dominating the entire government. How does that work in 2020 politics? How do we keep the factions from having so much power in the government? Well, this goes back to one of our chapter 1 ideas here, one of the theories of democracy, which is pluralism. Okay, pluralism tells us that it's okay to have these groups, these factions, because there are so many factions out there that the factions compete with each other. So we don't have to worry about the Democrats dominating every branch of the government, because the Republicans are right there to compete with them at every branch of the government. And that limits the power of each group. We don't have to worry about the NRA dominating every branch of government, because if they gain some influence in one branch of government, they could be overruled by factions in different branches of government. So if the NRA gains influence in the Senate, there's probably a different faction, maybe an interest group like Moms Demand Action Against Gun Violence. Maybe that group has influence in the House. And so in this way, it's okay to have factions because the factions compete against each other, and no single faction will be able to dominate the politics of the government, because all these factions, because they have the freedom to participate, they compete with each other and they control themselves. Remember, pluralism is not necessarily a criticism. Pluralism says that there are groups, but kind of encourages groups, because these groups or these factions limit each other's power by competing together for these political resources. Finally, with Federalist 10, I want to leave you guys with probably the most famous quote from Federalist 10. This would be something that we might expect to see along the way here, but this is a big-time quote from Federalist 10 about the factions. Madison says, "Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires." So what he's saying here is that it's our freedoms that are the cause or the fuel for the factions, right? Because we have the freedom of expression, the freedom to speak out, the freedom of press to get information. That's what causes factions to take place. He says without that freedom, it would instantly expire. We wouldn't have factions if we didn't have any of these rights, but it's much more important to have those rights, right? He goes on to say, "It could be no less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency." So he's recognizing that the freedoms that we have are the source and the power that fuels the factions. So even though that freedom he sees as helping to cause potential dangers in the form of factions, that it is definitely not worth ending those freedoms, because those freedoms are the main feature of our political life. Those features are the most important things about what we are as a democracy, that we have the freedom to speak, to voice our opinions by voting and participating, and to be critical of our leadership and to make them try to bend to our will. So that's Federalist 10. That's the biggest the most famous of the Federalist Papers. This is written by Madison. This is an explanation of how the large republic, that form of government, a large republic, is the best form of government to control the effects that factions might have on the government.